Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 7 and 8 of Star Trek Prodigy. I thought episode 7 was kind of weak and boring and with a few things that annoyed me, but episode 8 was actually pretty good in my opinion. It finally had some science fiction stuff, it finally felt like Star Trek, and was pretty fun overall. But let me start with the previous episode. Episode 7 was kind of weak in my opinion, not a lot of interesting stuff, and it introduced a Ferengi woman who turns out to be a villain, which wasn't a big surprise, and it's kind of going back to those stereotypical Ferengi who are always evil and greedy and will betray anyone and all of that. So that's something that Lower Decks actually amended for because they show that not all Ferengi are like that. And yet this show is once again showing those kinds of Ferengi. And this time it's a Ferengi female who is wearing clothes and making profit, which is totally fine since in the end of Deep Space Nine they said that all Ferengi females were liberated, they're as free as the men now. But the continuity problem is that why are her ears looking exactly like males, since in Deep Space Nine they always showed us that Ferengi females have much smaller ears than the males. I guess maybe it's because she's older, with age, ears are becoming bigger. Mugi also had slightly bigger ears. Maybe it's a Ferengi transgender who used to be a male and became a woman, or maybe that female augmented her ears to become bigger because for the Ferengi it's a symbol of how successful they are or something. So I guess we can explain it away. Still, it was kind of noticeable, so that was a slight continuity mistake, even though at least they made the design look like the actual Ferengi from the old Trek shows, unlike Star Trek Discovery, which tried to redesign them for some reason. But the episode overall wasn't really that interesting. They basically, that Ferengi needs a crystal, and so to get that crystal, they have to make contact with the pre-warp civilization. And Janeway does mention the Prime Directive, but she doesn't seem to be against making contact with those aliens, which by itself seems like a contradiction with the Prime Directive, since they're only supposed to contact aliens after they reached warp capabilities, or at least subspace communication. I would imagine that would make sense, since if they could communicate with aliens by themselves, then they know about aliens already, so why not make first contact? So I would be okay with that. But they established that these aliens never made contact with any other aliens, and so first contact seems to be kind of a violation of the Prime Directive by itself, which Janeway never mentions. But this ship is kind of from the future after Voyager, so maybe they augmented the Prime Directive, altered it a little bit. Maybe it is allowed to make first contact with aliens even before they achieved warp capabilities. It especially would make sense in the light that apparently warp is only possible if you have dilithium crystals. And so what if a planet simply doesn't have those kinds of crystals and therefore will never be able to make warp flights? And so why would they be banned from the rest of the galaxy just because they happen not to have any crystals? So that's why I would be okay with changing the Prime Directive and First Contact a little bit. So I don't have any huge problem with all of that. It just seems like a little bit of a lack of continuity. So I would have changed the dialogue just slightly to explain away all these things, and then that will be fine. And speaking of crystals, those aliens actually do have some strange crystals which that Ferengi wants. Which begs the question, why didn't this Ferengi simply go down to that planet by herself and get those crystals? Why did she need this crew to help her? It doesn't really make sense. So a lot of things in this episode don't really make much sense and not really that interesting. And the way that the Ferengi who basically raised this kid totally backstabs him and betrays him with no remorse whatsoever. So it's kind of going back to those stereotypical Ferengi who are just evil for no reason, which kind of ruins the whole message, which Lower Decks actually got better by saying that none of those aliens are inherently evil and all of that. It's all a matter of culture and so on. And especially since this is a Ferengi female and she and her kind used to be oppressed on their own planet not that long ago, so why is she behaving exactly like the men who oppressed her and her kind? So things like that kind of bugged me a little bit, and the episode overall just wasn't that interesting. But the next episode, episode 8, was much better, and it finally felt like Star Trek and like science fiction. And at first I thought it's going to just repeat the same exact ideas that previous shows did, namely those episodes about, the ship blowing up and then everything resetting and repeating itself until they again blow up again and again, which was done in TNG, and then in Star Trek Discovery they used exactly the same idea. So when this episode started showing that, I was ready to roll my eyes and say, oh, not this again. But then they did it in a completely different way, which felt fresher and more interesting. So basically, because the ship went through some tachyon anomaly, it affected their super duper warp engine, and it created some kind of split of time frames for different characters. Each character is now moving at a different rate of time on the ship, and yet the ship itself in their own time seems to be functioning normally, which is kind of strange and not really that logical. But because they played with it in a fun way, I'm kind of willing to forgive that, and only the hologram Janeway is able to move between all different time frames and to deliver information between them. What's odd about all of this is that, if each of them is moving at a different rate, shouldn't they still see each other? The one who's moving slowly, shouldn't the others see her as being stuck in place and moving slowly? I think also that would be more fun. They could have done some jokes with that, some funny ideas with that. So the one moving slowly would see the other ones moving, zipping around very quickly. I guess if they're moving so quickly that it's beyond your perception, that will make sense why you cannot see them, but why would it work the other way around? The one who's moving slowly should be visible to the other ones. So I guess we can explain it with some subspace layers or whatever. We can make up excuses and say, no, these are different areas of the ship which are like in a different phase altogether, so you cannot interact. So I could be fine with that. It also reminds me of an episode of Voyager when different parts of the ship were suddenly back in time or in the future, and so it doesn't really make sense logically, but we can roll with it because it's fun, so I'm okay with that. So this episode had those kinds of ideas, and it played with them in a fun way. So only the hologram Janeway can exist in all these different time frames, and the other characters each have a different amount of time left until the warp core explodes. So for some it happens in seconds, for others it takes months to reach that point, and so hologram Janeway is basically delivering messages. And there was a funny moment when she tries to get that kid to help, and she explains the situation to him, but he just pretends to listen, and he plays on the pad on his bed and just and that part kind of made me laugh. So hologram Janeway is like a mom who tries to get her kid to do something and he doesn't listen, so that part did kind of crack me up. And there were a lot of cute character moments. I still think Rock Talk is my favorite character. Simply the cuteness of this character is kind of nice. And they also did some character development that basically she had to learn to become an engineer to save the ship. Previously they put her as the security officer because she's physically the toughest, I guess, and she didn't like that job. And now this is her opportunity to prove that she's also capable in other areas, and so that was nice overall. And there's even some parts with the villains which was interesting. We once again see that Sith Lord villain who wants to get his hands on the ship, and yet the ship is so far away now, and he got a message from that female Ferengi who sold out the ship for profit, even though it's unclear how will she get paid for this, but whatever, she gave the information to the villain, and he now knows their location, but they're too far away. But he's somehow able to send General Grievous to that ship by printing him in the vehicle replicator, which I thought was a cool idea. Even though how exactly does he hack the ship from such a great distance? So he transmits Grievous to the ship, and then he prints himself in the vehicle replicator, and then we see like a cheaper version of this General Grievous guy coming out of the vehicle replicator, and he's now on the ship as well, and he actually ends up helping save the ship because his master wants the ship for himself. He doesn't want it to blow up, so he actually is useful in the episode. And this robot villain actually starts to grow on me. He is kind of cool in many ways, even though obviously it's not very original. His head is basically a Terminator head. So I liked the idea of him coming to the ship through the vehicle replicator. And also finally the villains of the show actually do something, because so far, except for the first episode, they didn't really do much. They were just always in the background. So finally we get some interactions. And what's also nice in this episode is how the main crew learns to work together, because they basically have to work as a team to save the ship. And so even in the beginning of the episode, when they're in the holodeck, they're playing that puzzle game that you have to figure out how to cross a river by carrying different things in the boat and all of that. That's kind of one of those classic riddles that you have to solve. And then the episode itself is also like that, so I liked it. And so all of that stuff with each character being stuck in a different phase of time and having to help each other out despite of that limitation, and using Janeway as the conduit, that was kind of neat. It also reminds me of a computer game I remember I loved as a kid, which was called the Day of the Tentacle, in which you had 3 characters that you can control, and each of them got stuck in a different time. One of them in the past, one of them in the present, and one in the future, and they were all in the same house but in different time frames, and yet they had to work together, and they did it by sending small items to each other through a small portal. which was the toilet of the time machine that they arrived in the different time frames in, which the time machines broke down, but the portal toilet still worked, and so they could transmit small items to each other. And in some cases, they could simply hide items in the past, and then they could get in the future that way. If they needed something to age, then that's how they did it. And that was a really interesting and fun game, and it made you think four-dimensionally and all of that. So I loved that game as a kid. And so this episode really reminds me of that kind of idea of having to solve this puzzle in a clever way. So finally, this felt like a clever episode with some science fiction idea, with some classic Star Trek kind of ideas, and even the villain got involved. And so all of this was really fun, and some of the jokes were really funny this time. So I think this might be the best episode of the whole show so far. Finally, it feels like science fiction, like Star Trek, with some cute character moments, even some action scenes with the villain, and so overall a good episode. So that's my review. That's all I have to say about these episodes for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.